Hello, my name is Jessica Saligumba, and today I will be presenting my Reconciliation Indigenization Creative Project. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional Coast Salish lands, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Quick-Wet'lam, Squamish, and Musqueam Nation, and would like to thank them for allowing me to present my project on their territory. So I chose to do my creation as a drawing piece, as I wanted to not only experience, but also show a process of how long the creation of something takes. In its simplest form, I wanted to create a piece that embodied critical issues that needed to be addressed for Indigenous communities. I implemented this through puzzle pieces to express that even though it takes a while to put them together, eventually the pieces will come together to create a cohesive picture. I also want to represent that although all pieces are different, they are interconnected, and that one piece needs the other piece to form a clear picture. In this piece, I included critical issues that currently affect Indigenous people and communities, as well as critical topics discussed in class. So some of the topics that were discussed in class was healthcare, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, land rights and protection, and the adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. So on the top left, you can see that I wanted to include our guest speaker from a couple classes ago, Lorelei Williams, who was involvement in the Butterflies in Spirit. I really enjoyed her presentation and how she was able to express her vulnerability on the loss of her, I think it was her cousin or sister. And on the second picture, I included the BC Indigenous healthcare symbol. I also included the UNDRIP symbol of adopting and implementing. And on the very bottom is Ellen Gabriel. She was a critical activist during the Oka crisis or Kanastake resistance. So I really wanted to pay homage to how important land was for her. And I feel that her name isn't always recognized. So I wanted to give her a little bit of respect on that. A critical component to my piece is how it explains the substantial lack of strategies when developing policy. While my piece represented a puzzle, I wanted to emphasize that there are many issues that need to be properly assembled and that it is not difficult to put them together if one only allows for the time and the inclusion of Indigenous communities in its process. So these strategies include the duty to consult and the free and prior informed consent, proper inclusion, properly identifying the need, identify who will take responsibility, gathering important information, drafting clear policies, consult with appropriate stakeholders, discussion of who will approve policies, and also to consider whether there is a need for a clear guidance regarding how the policy will be implemented and by whom, and who will be responsible for developing these procedures. To my understanding, a stakeholder is a group or organization involved in or affected by a course of decisions. Essential stakeholders in developing policy include diverse groups, individuals who are directly affected by the issues represented, researchers, advocacy groups, policymakers, and social workers. Policies are most effective in those affected are consulted and supported and have the opportunity to consider and discuss the potential suggestions when creating a policy. Stakeholders that should be involved in developing policies include Indigenous supporters, leaders and volunteers, management committee members, Indigenous service members, and social workers. As a future social worker, one often finds themselves in a person in environment position or perspective in which they situate the person within a context. My role as a future social worker includes helping guide the decolonization of social work practice by helping to create an awareness of the effects of colonization and create less oppressive ways of delivering social services. Applying different lenses in my social work practice can help transform the field of social work and create more effective services with Indigenous people. Understanding and incorporating Indigenous knowledge and insight into the struggles of colonial policies and practices can center the role of recovery for Indigenous people who experience the effects of colonization, including racism, exploitation, oppression, and suppression of Indigenous culture and spirituality. An Indigenous land foregrounds the histories and current issues caused by colonization, the needs for self-determination, and self-government utilizing Indigenous worldviews. This view encourages social workers to recognize the current existing colonial policies and practices when reforming and recognizing these policies. There are several strategies a policymaker can do when developing policies. This includes addressing and including cultural appropriateness when creating a policy. So these were some of the key points that were discussed in class that I found very helpful when addressing and including cultural appropriateness. So these include the need to acknowledge that it starts with me first, increased knowledge around cultural nuances of the populations they are serving, commitment to gaining knowledge of history and adverse impacts of the harms done to Indigenous communities, invite Indigenous members from the community in different phases of policy development, acknowledging the journey of healing, which requires one to be open and to listen to what is needed for the care of Indigenous people. And a critical point that I found very key to including a cultural appropriateness is stepping back and creating a space for a community to lead in policy development goals and provide a supportive role. So when I say step back, I mean by social workers, any type of stakeholders, people who are not part of this key issues should be able to take a step back and recognize that developing policy is for them in the end. So I had a bit of trouble when developing my creative project. I found myself going back and forth on designs, whether to paint or draw, as well as creating a definitive piece that represented the importance of policymaking, including important figures. The biggest challenge I faced was knowing what to include in the puzzle, and that would create a cohesive piece. There were numerous issues Indigenous people and communities face that one piece I believe is not enough to outline the necessary need of representation of Indigenous community when developing policy. I did finally decide what to implement into a creative project where I wanted to include not only symbols, but actual people. A critical point that I learned throughout this assignment is how difficult developing or even considering what to include when developing a policy. I found myself going back and forth on questions like, what do I do? What do I add? Where do I begin? Who can I ask? Is this enough? Did I forget something? Could I accidentally offend someone? Is this appropriate? Yet, however many times I kept asking myself these questions, I always tried to move forward. That this creation is not solely about myself, but also who will be affected and continue to move forward and stand by my creation. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I hope that my piece was well enough to answer these questions, as well as it created a cohesive stance on really thoroughly understanding what policy is. And thank you again, and stay safe. Sorry, before I end, here are my references. Thank you again.